And that is Prime Minister Justin Trudeau speaking at the United Nations General Assembly, about a 30-minute long speech, and just about every minute of those 30 minutes was dedicated to Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples, often pointing out the painful relationship, saying the experience was mostly one of humiliation, neglect, and abuse, and bringing up some of the plans that the government has in changing that relationship that Canada has had with its Indigenous peoples. The CBC's Stephen D'Souza is at the UN in New York, and Evan Dyer joins us from Ottawa as well. So let's begin, though, with Stephen outside the United Nations. And Stephen, it is interesting, you know, I was counting, it was about an 11-page long speech, and as I mentioned, I would say 8 or 9 of those 11 pages dedicated entirely to the often problematic and painful the relationship that Canada has with its Indigenous peoples, and then pointing out some of the progress that the government says that it has accomplished, but that the way forward is much longer. Why do you think it is that Justin Trudeau has chosen the General Assembly in New York to talk about this?
Well, it's interesting. You know, last year the Prime Minister was here to announce that Canada was back on the world stage, and now he comes before world leaders and the international community to admit that Canada has a lot of problems. Canada is a flawed country, but he used that example and the example of Canada's engagement with Indigenous communities to show that the country is not afraid of dealing with its problems at home, and he was quite stark and quite open about those problems, calling it a great shame in terms of how successive governments have dealt with Indigenous peoples, that in many cases they still don't have respect. He said that Canada is a work in progress and that mistakes have been made, but this is where he sort of linked it to the experience of other countries, saying that the challenges that countries like Canada face are not unique, and the solutions are also not unique. And you saw there was a section in the middle where he talked about the Sustainable Development Goals, and those were goals that were adopted 2 years ago by the United Nations and countries around the world in order to eradicate poverty and ensure prosperity for all. And so when he was talking about the solutions that Canada is working towards for the Indigenous community, what he talked about was things like drinking water, quality education, safe communities, gender equality. These are all things that are issues that countries around the world are facing as well. And so what Justin Trudeau was hoping to do with the speech today, and you know, people can debate about how well he accomplished that, was to try to show that the issues that Canada is facing at home, as it attempts to work on those, these are issues that it can translate to the international stage. And while you have leaders like Donald Trump talking about countries looking after their own interests and not necessarily engaging with the international community, you have Justin Trudeau talking about working with the world, using that. And I believe we do have a clip from Trudeau's speech, if we can maybe play a little bit of that to give a sense of how he talked about what Canada is doing with the international, or with the Indigenous communities, and how that relates to an international declaration made by the United Nations on Indigenous peoples. Let's play that now if we haven't.
In the words of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the declaration provides the necessary principles, norms, and standards for reconciliation to flourish in 21st century Canada. That's not an aspiration. That's a way forward. Last year, at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, Canada's then Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs finally corrected Canada's position on the declaration and announced that we are now, without qualification, a full supporter of the declaration.
That was just one of many, quite a few moments where the Prime Minister received applause. I counted at least 5. One was on equal pay, that moment as well, and a couple moments when he was talking about climate change later on. And it was interesting, Andrew, how he did link the efforts to reconcile with the Indigenous communities to climate change. Yet another example of how what the issues Canada is facing at home, how they translate to the international stage.
Stephen, just one final question to you is, and I know that you've been busy outside, so you have been listening to all of the different leaders speaking, but would you say that it's unusual for a leader to be self-critical, to talk about, you know, the problems at home, not really to lecture? Sometimes that's used as a podium to lecture other countries about what they should be doing and how the world should be doing more. Would you say that the Prime Minister's speech is unusual in that sense?
I would say so, yeah. As you said, often leaders use this pulpit to bully other countries. They use it to call on the world to act to help that country's interests. Or in the case of, if we use Donald Trump as an example, to offer threats to other countries or to espouse a worldview that perhaps is more inward-looking than outward-focused. And so when you have a leader like Justin Trudeau come here and lay the country's issues bare the way he has, talking about the long issues, the long legacy of colonialism. If you looked around the room, those are issues that a lot of countries are dealing with. Some of those countries are colonial powers, and so that definitely is a different tact, and it'll be interesting to see how this message is received around the world.
All right, Stephen, thank you. The CBC's Stephen D'Souza live at the United Nations in New York. Now, the CBC's Evan Dyer.